In the winter of 1904, an American named Edward Herbert Thompson had himself lowered into the sacred well at Chichen Itza. He had bought the ruined plantation the well sat on, taught himself to dive in a heavy canvas suit, and rigged a dredge over the water. A limestone sinkhole the Maya had called the cenote of sacrifice. For years he hauled its floor up into the daylight and shipped the finds north to the Peabody Museum at Harvard, quietly, in a way that would later have Mexico fighting for decades to get them back. Gold discs, beaten thin, jade, carved wood, lumps of copal incense, and human bone, the remains of more than 100 people. But under all of it, lining the bottom of the well in a bed roughly 5 meters thick, was something Thompson barely remarked on, a layer of blue, not painted on anything, just blue settled into the mud like silt. Thompson himself nearly died down there. The crude diving gear left him half deaf and battered by the bends, and the treasure he shipped to Harvard would tangle Mexico and the United States in a dispute that ran for the better part of a century. Everyone argued over the gold. Almost no one, for decades, asked about the blue. It was the least valuable thing in the well, and, as it turns out, the most extraordinary. That blue is why we are here. It is a color the Maya made, and it has done something almost nothing else from the ancient world has managed. It has refused to fade. Murals painted with it in the 8th century are still vivid today, 1,200 years later in one of the harshest climates on Earth: heat, acid soil, mold and rain that eats limestone alive. We tend to think of a color as a thing. This one is not a thing, it is a recipe. A sequence of steps in a particular order that a civilization worked out and then, after the conquest, forgot. The pigment outlasted the people. The instructions did not. Tonight we reconstruct both. Maya blue turns up across Mesoamerica for more than 700 years. It is on the murals of Bonampak, painted around the year 790. Whole walls of ceremony and battle. The background a deep, living blue behind the musicians, under the feet of the lords in the painted sky. After 1,200 years in a jungle that long ago swallowed the roof above them, it is still the most alive color on the wall. It is on pottery, on carved stone, on temple walls. Centuries after the Maya first mixed it, the Aztecs were still using it far to the west, at their great temple in Tenochtitlan. It even survives on the plaster of the colonial churches the Spanish built directly on top of Maya towns. And it is the same clean, faintly greenish blue every time. Here is why that should be impossible. The blue comes from indigo, the dye pressed from the anil plant, and one of the most fugitive colors in nature. Sunlight slowly breaks the indigo molecule apart. Left on its own, the dye fades within a few years, and dyers have fought that fading for as long as there have been dyers. Now put it in the Yucatan. Hot, wet, moldy, acidic conditions that reduce most ancient color to a faint stain. By every reasonable expectation, this blue should be long gone. It is not. When chemists first took Maya blue seriously in the 20th century, the ceramic specialist Anna Shepard suspected early on that its secret lay not in the dye but in the clay it was ground with, a hunch it would take decades to confirm. The most patient of the investigators was Rutherford Gettens, a conservation scientist who published a paper in the journal American Antiquity in 1962 with an honest title, Maya Blue, an Unsolved Problem in Ancient Pigments. Gettens found that the color survived hot mineral acids and heating to around 250 degrees. It would not be destroyed by boiling nitric acid, which told him it could not be an ordinary plant dye, because an ordinary plant dye would have been eaten alive, and yet he could not say what it actually was. His problem, he admitted, was that he had almost nothing to work with, only thin films of the blue scraped from potsherds and crumbs of wall plaster, a dye that should fade in a season on a wall in a jungle, holding its color for 12 centuries and shrugging off acid in a laboratory. Gettens had proved what it survived. He could not yet say why. The color simply would not die. The answer came 4 years later in 1966, from the chemist Van Olphen writing in the journal Science. Maya blue, he showed, is not a mineral, and it is not simply a dye. It is two ordinary things forced into one. The first is that fugitive indigo. The second is palygorskite, a humble, chalky white clay, sometimes called attapulgite, threaded at the microscopic level with tiny open channels, like a bundle of drinking straws too small to see. Those channels normally hold water. Warm the clay and the water is driven out, grind in the indigo and hold it at the right heat, and the dye molecules slide into the empty channels and lodge there, plugging them shut. Van Olphen built the pigment himself, from scratch, and his laboratory version behaved exactly like the ancient one. It refused to fade, and it refused to dissolve in acid. A Mexican researcher, Constantino Reyes Valerio, spent years chasing the same reconstruction from the archaeology side, and by the early 1990s had worked out a practical method a Maya painter could plausibly have used, mixing the añil with the local clay and warming it over a fire. And that heat is the crux. A window, not a setting, too cool, and the dye never bonds. Too hot, and the indigo simply burns away, and the blue is lost. Somewhere in between is a narrow band the Maya found and hit, by hand, over an open flame without a thermometer, again and again, for centuries. That is the whole trick. And it is a strange one. Apart, neither ingredient is remarkable. The dye fades. The clay is just clay. Fused, the clay becomes armor wrapped around the color, sealing the fragile dye inside a lattice that acid and sunlight cannot reach. The clay was the cage. The color was the prisoner. What makes this genuinely startling is that neither half hints at the whole. Nothing about a pot of pale clay suggests it can make a dye immortal. Nothing about a fading blue suggests it is one warm afternoon away from lasting 1,000 years. Somebody at some point put two unpromising things together, warmed them, and found permanence. We do not know who, and we do not know how they first stumbled onto it. We only know they kept the result and passed it on. 30 years after Van Olphen in 1996, a team led by the materials scientist Miguel José-Yacaman put authentic Maya blue under an electron microscope and published what they saw, again in Science. At the scale of billionths of a meter, the pigment is not a smear of dye on clay. It is a structured composite. The clay crystals line up into what the team called a superlattice, and threaded through it are nanoparticles, specks of metal and oxide, only a few atoms across, embedded in the material. The full beauty of the color they showed appears only when both the ordered lattice and the tiny particles are present. They gave the paper a title that says the whole thing plainly, an ancient nanostructured material. The durability everyone had marveled at for a century was not luck, and it was not magic. It was structure, order imposed at a scale no human would even have a word for until the late 20th century. Put that in proportion. The particles doing the work are a few billionths of a meter across, thousands of times thinner than a human hair. The field that studies matter at that scale, nanotechnology, did not even have a name until the 1970s, and did not become a working discipline until the 1990s, the very decade this paper appeared. The Maya were engineering at the nanometer scale 1,000 years before anyone built the microscopes that could finally see what they had done. We should be honest about the edge of this because it is still moving. Later researchers, among them Manuel Sanchez del Rio, took Maya blue to synchrotrons, machines that fire intense X-rays at a sample, to map its structure more finely, and the picture got richer and more argued over, not simpler. In 2006, a team led by the chemist Antonio Domènech Carbó reached for a different tool, electrochemistry, and added a real twist. As the pigment is heated, some of the indigo turns into a related molecule, dihydroindigo, and it is that molecule that pushes the color from clean turquoise toward green. If they are right, the Maya could tune the exact shade just by controlling the heat, bluer or greener, on purpose, by feel. Precisely how the two molecules sit inside the clay channels is still being worked out in the journals right now. And some even think the word nano claims a little more than the evidence strictly shows. The mechanism is not closed, and a careful viewer should hold the finest details loosely. But the headline holds, and it is remarkable enough on its own. The Maya built a material atom by atom, without knowing that atoms existed. For a long time, the natural assumption was that Maya blue came out of a workshop, mixed, fired, ground, then carried wherever it was needed. In 2008, the anthropologist Dean Arnold and his colleagues, writing in the journal Antiquity, found something stranger, and they found it in an object that had been sitting in plain sight. It was a plain three-legged bowl, dredged from that same sacred well at Chichen Itza that had rested since 1932 in a drawer of a museum in Chicago. Fused to the inside of the bowl was a lump of copal, the resin incense the Maya burned in ritual. And inside that lump were both ingredients of Maya blue, the palygorskite clay and the indigo caught together in the middle of becoming the pigment. Think about what that means. The Maya were not making the color in a workshop and carrying it to the temple. They were making it at the temple, in that bowl, on the burning incense as part of the ceremony itself. The copal smoked. The heat of the sacred fire married the clay to the dye, and the blue was born in the smoke. And the color they were making was not neutral. Blue was the color of shock, the rain god, the color of water and sky, the exact thing a farming people on thin limestone soil begged the heavens for. This matters more when you remember what was happening to the Maya world. Cores drilled from lake beds and mineral layers grown drip by drip in caves record repeated, punishing droughts across the Maya lowlands between roughly 800 and 1000. The same window in which one great city after another fell silent and emptied. When the rain fails and the corn dies, a farming people does not stop believing in the rain god. It pleads with him harder to make chalk's own color. In the act of pleading with him for water was not decoration. It was survival, painted, so the pigment was not manufactured, it was performed. The recipe and the rite were the same act, which brings us back to Thompson's 5-meter bed of blue on the floor of the well. The Maya painted the things they gave to the cenote that color first, pots, carved wood, and the evidence indicates people. Offerings were painted with Maya blue, the color of chalk, and given to the water, which the Maya understood as a doorway down into Xibalba, the underworld, over centuries. Offering after offering, the pigment loosened, drifted, and settled until the floor of the sacred well held a layer of blue 5 meters deep. Thompson pulled the remains of more than 120 people out of that water. Sit for a moment with what that layer is. You're looking at the sediment of a religion. Every grain of that blue was once a coat of paint on something, or someone a community was about to give to the god. And here the record demands real care, because for a century it was told wrong. The popular story, the beautiful young woman thrown to the well, turns out to be largely a Victorian invention. In 2024, a genetic study published in Nature, led by Rodrigo Barquera, examined the remains of 64 sacrificed children pulled from a chamber beside the cenote. Every single one was a boy, most between 3 and 6 years old, given to the gods across 500 years. Nearly a quarter were close relatives, including 2 pairs of identical twins. That last detail reaches straight into the Popol Vuh, the Maya epic of the hero twins Hunahpu and Xbalanque, who go down into the underworld and outwit death itself. The truth was stranger and sadder than the Victorian tale of the drowned maiden, and it took ancient genomes to recover it. We say this plainly because the channel is built on saying it. Much of what everyone knows about this well was wrong, and the blue is one of the few parts we can be sure of. Making the pigment survived, knowing how to make it did not. After the Spanish conquest, Maya blue slowly fell out of use, and for a long time no one could even say which clay, from which ground, the Maya had drawn on. The material outlived the map to its own ingredients. Only recently did that gap begin to close. In 2012, Dean Arnold and his colleagues published, in the Journal of Archaeological Science, the first direct match between real Maya blue and its actual mineral sources, palygorskite from a mine at Sakhalin and from a place called Yo-Sakab near Tikul, both in the Yucatan. They tied the clay in centuries-old pigment to specific holes in the ground, some of which the Maya had dug for so long that the mines themselves are now archaeological sites. There is a quiet irony in where that clay ended up. Palygorskite today is an ordinary industrial mineral, dug by the ton for drilling fluids, for filters, for the absorbent granules in cat litter. The same humble clay the Maya once carried up out of a sacred mine to make the color of their rain god now sits unremarked in a hardware aisle. And the pigment itself has quietly returned in an unexpected place, the laboratory, where materials scientists now study Maya blue as a model for exactly what modern industry wants: a stable, non-toxic color locked inside a mineral, a template for greener pigments, and for trapping other fragile molecules the same way the Maya trapped indigo. A recipe the Yucatan forgot has become one the future is trying to relearn. We can make Maya blue again, but as outsiders reverse engineering a lost craft, not as heirs who were handed it warm, and the work is not finished. Even this year, researchers are still tracing which Maya communities took their clay from which source, because the answer is not one mine, but many scattered across the peninsula. We are reassembling the instructions from the outside, one potsherd at a time. Here's what the blue keeps teaching us. A color is a recipe, and a recipe is a conversation, a set of instructions handed from person to person, alive, only as long as someone keeps saying it out loud. Maya blue lasted because the Maya locked the fragile part, the color inside the durable part, the clay. What they could not lock down was the knowledge of how to do it, that lived only in people, and people are more fragile than pigment. Every generation that knew it had to hand it, whole, to the next, miss a single handoff. One workshop that closed, one elder taken by an epidemic before teaching a child, and the chain breaks for good. So the blue outlasted the hands that mixed it, and then it outlasted the memory of how it was mixed at all. That is the strange arithmetic of this color. The most delicate thing in it, a plant dye that fades in a single season, is the part that survived 12 centuries of jungle. The instructions, which weighed nothing and needed only to be spoken, are the part we very nearly lost, and are only now reading back. The pigment was never the hard part to keep. The knowing was, if you want to see more of what the record keeps hidden, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.